Hello, friends. Let's talk today about writing your first or even your fifth novel. This is going to be the first video in a series of deep dives that we're going to do into the publishing process. And the first part of the publishing process is writing your novel. Now, normally, when I'm talking about publishing, I'm not going to bother talking about writing because obviously if you don't know how to write a book, you're not going to be able to publish. But because we're doing this deep dive, I thought, I should probably start with the very beginning, which is how do you even write a book? And I actually ran across a really good thread on X, Twitter, I don't even know. Anyway, I ran across this really good thread talking about a super simple, basic process for writing nonfiction books. And I read it and I was actually like really excited because I realized as I was reading it that I follow a very similar process but for fiction. And so that's the process that I'm going to break down for you today. If you want to see the original thread, you can hunt it down. Nicholas Cole is the guy who put it together, and he's actually got a ton of writing education stuff, mostly focused into nonfiction. But a lot of it is very applicable to what we do as fiction authors. Now, I do think it's important to say that writing is more accessible than ever. The ability to write a novel is super accessible, but it's still not easy. And I think that that sometimes we conflate those two things. We say because something has become accessible, it has become easy, and that's not true. Now, there are a lot of people online talking about AI tools that can make your writing easy. In my experience, and I've done a lot of testing with various AI tools just because I'm interested in technology in general, I've done a lot of testing, and I think that for fiction, AI isn't very helpful. Now, again, personal opinion, I know a lot of people who disagree with me, and if any of you disagree with me, I'd be happy to have a conversation in the comments about that. But I just don't think that it's as helpful as people imagine. So the long and short of it is that if you're going to write, you still have to do the writing. And if you want to write well, you definitely have to do the writing. But let's talk about the actual process of writing a book. So this process breaks down into 5 very simple steps. Again, not easy steps, but simple. The first one is pick your core genre, and then pick your subgenres. See, your core genre is going to give you a list of tropes that are necessary for your book. And your subgenres are going to adapt or modify those tropes to meet reader expectation. And that's super important. If you're writing fiction, meeting reader expectation is probably the most important thing you're going to do as an author, because if you don't meet reader expectation, people aren't going to continue reading your books. They're not going to buy from you. And then all of a sudden you don't have a career, okay? So meeting reader expectation is super important, and you do this by understanding what genre you're writing in and understanding the subgenres that are going to, change that. Now, some people might say, but Seth, I don't know what genre this is, right? I just have this idea for a story and I'm going to write it. No, don't do that. You can do that, but you're going to find that it's a very messy process. If instead you have a really good idea, just think to yourself, okay, what genre is this going to be? And then as you're writing, if it doesn't work, you can come back to this step and you can say, well, I thought it was suspense, but it's really more horror. So maybe I'll make some adjustments and I'll adjust during one of the later stages, but I'm going to change the genre. That's fine. Doesn't matter, right? But you want to start with something in mind. And so picking your core genre, deciding that, this is going to be an action adventure, or deciding this is going to be a romance, deciding, I'm going to write a high adventure lit RPG, or I'm going to write a political intrigue lit RPG. Whatever you decide, by picking the genre, you're going to, again, provide yourself with guide rails, this list of tropes that you need to hit as you move through your story. Now, the reason you also want to pick your subgenres is because very rarely is a book ever just one genre. So instead of trying to say, well, I'm only going to write a mystery, being able to identify the particular kind of mystery, right? This is going to be a suspenseful mystery, right? I'm going to add the suspense genre in, or a thriller, which weirdly are two different things. But you could also say it's going to be cozy, right? There are all these different subgenres that you can add in to get the exact story that you want. You might say, hey, this is going to be a mystery, but I'm going to add a Western element to it, or I'm going to add a dystopian or a sci-fi element to it. I'm going to add, modern realism. There are all of these different subcategories that you can use to modify the genre to get the exact story style or type that you want. So this is where we start. We start with picking our genres. Now, once you've done that, it's time to plot your story out. Now, some people are, and I was very much in this boat, absolute pantsers, in that they find it easy to simply sit down and start writing. And that's fine. You can do that. However, I would highly recommend, and this is coming from someone who was a pure pantser. Like I did not write a plot down for my first 4 or 5 books. Like there was nothing written down. I just wrote them. Okay. I don't recommend that if you want to be anything but an amateur. And the reason I don't recommend that is because it creates a ton of friction in the process. No matter how good of a pantser you are, it's going to create a lot of friction. More than that, it then creates a tremendous debt that you have to go back and pay. And that is in revision and in editing and stuff like that. So you can save yourself a lot of trouble if you just learn how to plot. Plotting is definitely a skill, and it's something that I had to practice and learn over time. And I still plot a lot lighter than most people I know. I'm going to take you through my version of plotting with this second point and identify some places where you can extend it or expand it. There are a ton of different ways to plot. You need to find something that works for you. And I'm going to give you, again, what I think is a good method and the method that I use on a daily basis. And you can decide for yourself whether this is going to work for you or you want to try something else. So the first thing we're going to do when we're plotting is we are going to determine how many chapters the book is going to be. And I know that some people are like, you can't do that. The story has to be as long as you want it to be. False. I write 45 to 47 chapter books, depending on which series it's in, sometimes as high as 52. And I write them all down ahead of time. And I determine how many chapters it's going to be, and that's what I have. And I build my plot for that length. Different stories require different lengths. If you're writing epic fantasy, then I would plan for 100 chapters or 200 chapters, right? Depending on how long you want the book to be and how long your chapters are. But for me, I know that my chapters are going to be about 2,500 words, and so I'm going to write 47 of them, which is about 120,000 words for a total book. Because my chapters are, it's technically 48 chapters is at 2,500 words is 120,000. But because I write a little bit more than 2,500 words in each chapter, across the chapters, it ends up being closer to 47. Anyway, total tangent. So you're going to determine how long you want your book to be. And you're just gonna pick the length arbitrarily. Again, this might change. That's okay. Doesn't matter. What you want now are guide rails. You want something to clarify your mission. So one of the most important things about being able to get into flow, and one of the most important things about deliberate practice, and one of the most important things about any sort of goal setting is clarity. So no matter what you're doing, you want to be clear about what you're trying to accomplish. Once you've determined how many chapters you want, I like to go through and I like to write a single phrase for each chapter that identifies how that chapter pushes the plot forward. Okay, this is super high level. What happens in that chapter that pushes the plot forward. Sometimes I'll say something like, main character gets into a big fight, or they sail towards the next town, or a conversation about X, Y, or Z. That's it. All I'm doing is giving myself a really high level, this is what happens. Okay? Once you've done that, for all 47 chapters, or however many chapters you're doing, the next step is to start adding beats. Now, in my chapters, because I have 2,500 words, I like 5 to 6 beats. I've determined that based on my writing cadence, I am typically going to use, between 3 and 6, really. But I want to have more just because when one of my beats ends up really short, it allows me to fill the chapter, right? And all I'm trying to do with this is add in those beats under that single phrase heading. These are the things that have to happen in the chapter in order to achieve the objective. In order for the conversation about X, Y, or Z to be successful, the characters need to do these specific things, right? 5 or 6 things, just listed out. Now, by the time you finish this, by the time you get through labeling all of your chapters and then adding 5 or 6 beats into each chapter, you have a completely plotted story. You have a completely plotted book. For me, this is all I need. This is enough direction that when I sit down to write, I have complete clarity about what I want to do, and I can just pants the rest. That doesn't work for everybody. And if you're one of those people that doesn't work for, no problem. All you do now is you go back into your plot and you start adding detail, right? Flesh out each of those sentences that identify the chapter. Look at the beats in the chapter and say, okay, what detail do I need to add to this chapter heading to really get a good sense of the scene? Do I need to identify where this takes place? Do I need to identify the characters that are present? Do I need to identify what happens with the world? And then once you've done that, once you've filled that out, start working your way through the beats, saying, okay, beat 1, what information do I need to add to this to get a comprehensive sense of the beat? Beat 2, same thing. Beat 3, beat 4, beat 5, beat 6, all the way through. And as you start to add detail and as you start to make the connections between all of these different things, you're going to be filling this out. And by the time you're done, you're going to have a fully fleshed out plot. And you can take this as far as you feel like you need to. I err on the side of less. Other successful authors err on the side of more. And it's just a matter of preference. Neither one is right or wrong. You can write a good book with sparse notes, and you can write a good book with incredibly detailed notes. Both are great. It's just a matter of what's comfortable for you as an author. This is the distinction that people are talking about when they talk about a pantser versus a plotter. And both of those are just styles of writing. They produce different things, and you don't have to be locked into the style that feels most natural for you. I felt like a complete pantser, but I've learned to plot, because one of the advantages of this system is that it allows you to write consistently. And we'll talk about this at the end of the video a little bit more, but consistent writing is the secret sauce. So now that we've finished our plot, we're going to go ahead and start our next step, which is drafting. This is the third step in our how to write a book plan. Now, if you're like me and you're a pantser, then you're going to look at your first chapter. You're going to see what it says. You're going to look at the first beat, and you're going to go, cool, and you're going to start writing. And you're going to use your plot as a rough guide to help you get where you want to go. But as you wander through your story, you might take detours. That's okay. You might find that you end up in a completely different place than you thought you were going to. That's okay. You can just pause, rewrite your plot, and then keep going. Or you can do what I do and just pretty much ignore your plot entirely and just see where the story goes. But what's nice about having the plot there is that you can at any point pause your writing, look over at your plot and say, okay, what is it that the characters should be doing? How do I move this story forward? And you'll have just this really handy guide in order to do that. If you're a plotter and you like those really, detailed plot lines, cool. Look at the first chapter, look what you wrote down for it, check your notes, check the first beat in the first chapter, and begin writing. And now you have a very handy guide that will literally walk you all the way through your story. And you can follow the instructions step by step. Think of it as a recipe. Now, drafting is the hard part. It's simple to say, just sit down and write, but it's a lot harder to actually do it. But as long as you can follow your plot, as long as you can remain consistent, then by the time you're done, you're going to have a book. But just because it's complete does not mean that you are done. Instead, we're going to move to our fourth step, which is revising. There are two different ways of revising. I practice one of them more than I practice the other, but I do practice both. The first way of revising is the traditional way of revising, which is where you finish your story and then you go back to the beginning and you read through your story and you make changes and edits and you rewrite chapters and you rewrite scenes and you rewrite characters as necessary, right? As you find that you should. And that is probably the most common way of revising. It takes a long time and it can produce tremendously good work. It can also ruin your story. Excuse me for a moment while I get on my soapbox, but one of the biggest problems that amateur writers have, or new writers have, is that they're not actually skilled enough to revise well. Because revision is a different skill set than drafting. Okay? And until you've drafted a lot, and until you have an instinctive sense for good writing, you don't necessarily know whether or not the changes you're making are helping or hurting. And often, new writers have a really hard time keeping their story in scope. Like everything in life, as we have new ideas and as we have new experiences, our vision for whatever we're working on shifts. When you go back to revise your story, you might be revising for a different objective or a different story than you originally set out to write. And so it can actually create problems inside a manuscript. Now, the better you get at writing, the more you do it, the less this is going to be a problem. And so I actually don't recommend that newer authors revise heavily, but I do recommend that authors who are further along in their careers get into the practice. This leads us to the second way of revising, which I think is accessible to everybody, new authors, older authors. And that is to revise as you go. This is a little bit of a different process than what we just talked about, where you just draft all the way through. Instead of thinking about your book as an entire unit, you instead think about a chapter or a section of chapters as a unit. And when you get to the end of those chapters, you go back and you do your revision, and then you continue on and you lock those chapters that you've already revised, and you don't touch them again. And then you write a new set of chapters, and then you go back and you revise them. And then you lock those ones, and then you write a new set of chapters, and then you go back and revise them. And this process, which is more of this, draft, revise, draft, revise, draft, revise loop, is more accessible to new authors because you have less time for your understanding of the story to shift. And by revising a few chapters at a time and then locking them and committing yourself to not touching them again, you establish the framework for the next set of chapters. And so you can achieve surprising internal consistency as you move from set of chapters to set of chapters to set of chapters. And you can do this, where a set of chapters is one chapter or, 3 or 4 chapters. But as you're doing that, you establish consistency across your story, because every time you set out to write new chapters, every time you're going to draft, you've just revised the old chapters, which were written based on the previous chapters. And because everything is locked, you have to resolve problems going forward. You're not going to go back and fix the problems that were back there, right? Instead, you have to figure out how to make those problems that you wrote in the first couple of chapters not problems at all. And when you do that, you create a thread of internal consistency. And so this is a style of revising that is actually very useful for everybody. It's especially useful for people who are learning how to write. Now, again, the first type of revision, I think, is really good if you have been in the game for a long time. If you're a good writer, you have a voice, you understand what kind of books you write, you understand what kind of story you're writing, you have the internal consistency in order to achieve the thing. Once you're there, once you've done this enough times, then going back and revising the entire document can actually be super helpful, because it'll let you catch things that you couldn't see initially. The problem is, again, that if you're not practiced, that if you don't have that internal consistency of voice, then you can create more problems than you're solving by trying to go back and revise. So until you have a locked-in voice, until you understand your voice really well, I think that the first kind of revising is not as helpful as the second. And we might call them macro revision, where you're revising the entire document or the entire manuscript in sort of one go, versus micro revision, where you're only revising a unit at a time. Again, 1 chapter to 4 chapters, maybe 5 or 6 chapters if that's your micro arc. But you're just revising a small amount, and then you're locking those chapters, and you're moving on to the next thing. From here, we would move into the editing stage, but I'm going to do an entire video on editing by itself, because I think that there's enough in that topic that I'd be here for another 40 minutes talking about it. So instead, what I want to do is I want to just give you some math really quick, because I think that this is a really important part of this whole process. If you want to write and publish a book, you need to write the book first. And that's what we've been talking about today. And I want to give you some encouragement, because sometimes when we look at the task of writing a book, it seems super simple, but it's also incredibly daunting, because it's hard. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of effort. But I've always found it very helpful to just look at the math. If you can write 1,000 words a day, 5 days a week, Monday through Friday, taking the weekends off, then in about 20 weeks, you're going to have a 100,000 word manuscript. If you can double that, if you can write 2,000 words a day, then in the course of a week, you're going to write 10,000 words, right? Which means it'll only take you 10 weeks to write a novel. That's like 3 months. But if you could write 2 chapters a day, which probably means spending 2 or 3 hours in the morning and 2 or 3 hours in the evening, or, a concentrated chunk of 4 or 5 hours, if you could do that, then you would find yourself with a 100,000 word manuscript in 5 weeks, a month. And that's not writing on the weekends. By simply being consistent, you are guaranteed to have a full manuscript in a much shorter amount of time than you might realize. Even if you can't write 20,000 words a week or even 10,000 words a week, that's okay. If you just write 5,000 words a week, which could be 1 day of working on your novel every week and getting those 5,000 words in, again, for me, that's 2 chapters, or you work on it twice a week and get those 5,000 words in, then in 6 months, you're going to have a novel. I know that 6 months sounds like a long time, but it's really not. So I would encourage you to give this a try. If you want to write a book and you want to publish it, you absolutely can. It's just a matter of sitting down and doing the work. So I would highly recommend that you start today. Commit yourself for the next week or 2 weeks to running through this process. Pick your genres, write down your plot, and then commit yourself to 1,000 to 2,000 words a day in drafting. Spend a little bit of time every week, maybe you can use Saturdays, to revise everything that you've written for that week, lock it in, and the next week, start again on your new set of chapters. One of the things that you're going to find is that as you start to do this consistently, you'll start to get faster. You'll start to get better at writing. And so you'll be able to increase the speed at which you write. You'll start writing more words per week. And before you know it, you're going to have that book in your hands. Like I said, this is the first in a series of videos doing a deep dive on the publishing process, how to get started with it. And in our next video, we're going to talk about editing, what to actually do with your manuscript once you are finished with it. If you have any questions or want me to cover any very specific topics, let me know down in the comments below. And as always, don't forget to like and subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.